Let's talk jig worms for a little bit. You know, we're going into the summer patterns, and a lot of my summer bites are going to be jig worm orientated. And I get a lot of questions every summer on jig worm. You know, jig worm is kind of like a Kleenex term. We use it loosely because it means so many different things. There's so many ways to fish a jig worm. There's so many variations. There's so many heads, so many plastics, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to walk you through just a variety of jig worm types. Everything from more aggressive, larger presentations to smaller finesse presentations, and just kind of show you how I'm fishing them, or at least talk about how I'm rigging them and what's going on. For starters, your standard jig worm. Most people are going to think of a jig worm and think of a 6-inch version twister tail. This is just a 6-inch worm. All the guys or gals put it on their favorite jig head. They hook it on there. Pretty basic, pretty simple concept, and that is probably the most basic jig worm approach. I just got an 1/8 ounce jig head or whatever size it takes to get down there into the conditions you're fishing. I got my worm, exposed hook, away you go. So this is the basic version, and there's a variety of ways you can do this, and I'm going to walk you through some different applications. So again, this is just your standard 6-inch Mr. Twister Phenom worm. Comes in a variety of colors. This will catch bass in all kinds of situations. Sometimes overthinking it is not necessary. Sometimes I just say simple stupid, catches fish, and it will. So that's the basic definition of a jig worm. And I'm going to show you a variety of ways to fish different types of jig worms or rig different types of jig worms. For starters, I like a longer shanked hook if I'm using the longer ribbon style type worms, okay? Whether it's a 6-inch worm, a bigger 10-inch worm, you want that longer shanked hook. So there's a different type of jig worm head, and I'll show you some differences. So you've got some longer shanked hooks like the Mighty Jig from All Terrain. You got that long shanked hook. That would work well with both of those worms I just showed you. Same thing with like a drop TG, longer shank hook. And then a shorter shank hook would be more of the application you hear about Ned Rig fishing. And that's gonna be just that short little stubby hook. A bunch of companies make that as well. So it depends on the plastic you're fishing, in my opinion, on the type of hook and hook shank and length that you want to apply onto that plastic. So for starters, the longer shank hook's going to work good for these longer ribbon worms. It's going to work good for your stick baits like a Cometa. A lot of anglers will just take that longer shank jig head and they'll just throw on their favorite 5 or 6-inch soft plastic stick bait. And I'll show you here. I'm just rigging that right up, pushing right up, and there. That's a jig worm. That's another definition of a jig worm. This is going to fish heavy, right? So now you have that Cometa, that Senko style bait. It's going to drop quick. It's going to plummet through weeds. So if I'm going to fish maybe in a little bit of heavier cover, there's a good chance I might fish something similar to this. Now, as you move along the transition of fishing the jig worm, you can definitely use this same jig head and throw on a larger 8-inch, 9-inch, 10-inch profile worm, and now you got a different profile as well. That's a larger jig worm, same head. One thing I've been playing with too, in a shaky worm version, is that Mighty head in a smaller, getting away from me, smaller size. You can see that worm, that's just a 6-inch tri-live crawler, like a shaky worm, another jig worm application. So various ways to fish that longer shanked hook. But that exposed hook is nice. You can rip it through the weeds. I'm usually fishing a 20-pound braid with a fluorocarbon leader on a spinning rod. Very efficient, very effective. I can cover a lot of water, do a lot of things with that. So that longer shanked hook really can get the job done. And one easy trick, we showed you this first one we rigged up. I'm going to show you. So you have your Cometa, you have your Senko, and we're going to talk about this next transition into a smaller jig worm, finesse jig worm, or you might have heard of Ned Rig. What you can do with that same thing, I can take some off, cut it down to 3 inches, put that same plastic back on there. Now I'm jumping into the Ned Rig world. So that's one way to take that same plastic, get the most out of it, and continue to fish in a jig worm fashion. Now Ned rigging, that's the one I showed you here. This is that new Ned ringer from Mr. Twister. So you can see here, and I'll show you, this hook is a smaller hook, smaller gap, smaller shank, smaller profile, designed to be more of a finesse application, hit the bottom, do its thing, and that's where you have these smaller plastics. So if you want to downsize that Senko or that Cometa type bait, you can fish that with one of these type of jig heads as well. So this is called a Ned Rig. In my opinion, still part of the jig worm family. I'm fishing on a similar setup with that braid to fluorocarbon application leader, you know, medium light spinning rod, good reel, and away you go. So many different ways to fish the jig worm. It's kind of an open can. So many people can talk about all these different things. You might hear the term often, like I said, mentioned jig worm. It's not all created equal. They could be relating or talking about any one of these things we just mentioned. So there's a basic rundown on the jig worm, some ways to rig it, some ways to use it. All of them will catch fish in certain situations. Sometimes all of them catch fish in the same situation. So try the jig worm. It's summertime. That's the bite you're going to want to chase. That's what catches a lot of big fish in this boat, and we're excited to put it to work again this summer.